We still have a couple more people entering, but let's get started. So welcome. I'm Oleni, and you are joining the third session in a three-part series that was on logic model and data-driven decision making. So again, this is the third session in a three-part series, so it's the last session. Let's move on. So let's just do our disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Okay, now that we've been disclaimed, I'm Oleni. I'll be one of your facilitators. Also is Tracy.
Good afternoon from Denver, Colorado.
And we'll be tag teaming on today's session. So let's move in. We got a lot of things to go through today, and so we want to get cracking. Let's go and move on to our session objectives. So we are, just to let you folks know, the people attending today come from the range of OIE grant programs. And so we have NAL, ACE, NYCP, STEP, and PD grantees joining us. And so just to let you know who's on the line. But today's session for our objectives is that we want to go ahead and explain the components of data literature, culture, and program, explore the benefits and importance of data-driven decision-making, learn how to implement a data-driven decision-making cycle, as well as make connections between the logic model that we went through in the last two sessions, evaluation, as well, and data-driven decision-making. In the last two sessions, we explored various types of logic models and how they connect to different types of program evaluation. And so we're going to be digging in a little bit deeper about how you take the logic model and the data you're collecting or gets generated from your logic model in order to do continuous improvement and continue to both improve your program as well as to maybe revise and hone your logic models. So before we get started, we just sort of wanted to take a short poll and sort of see what your current knowledge is related to data-driven decision making. So we have a poll popping up that has ranges between 1 and 5. 1 meaning I have no knowledge of data-driven decision making, and 5 meaning I have a great deal of knowledge of data decision making. And then 2, 3, and 4 are somewhere in between. So the poll should be popping up. Awesome. Thanks for filling out that poll. Let's take a look at where everybody's at. Oh, great. We have we have a few people with a great deal of knowledge. Awesome. And then we also have some 29% of people who have some knowledge of data driven. And then also, so we have nobody does not know about data decision making. So that's great to know. We've all sort of heard about it, have a little knowledge, all the way to we have a great deal of knowledge. Again, I want to open this up to you folks. If you have a great deal of knowledge or have experience in this, please feel free to provide your insights in the chat as we go through this session. Always wanting to learn and have more minds around our learning. So let's move on to just sort of where we ended last time in our last logic model session. We were looking at evaluation and feedback loops. We had sort of worked on what you would call a very linear logic model, and then had started to have some discussion regarding evaluation and feedback loops. And this is really a different visual representation of an actual logic model. It includes feedback loops and also some anticipates maybe some obstacles or challenges. And so, you may want to take your logic model and make a flow chart around how you want to make sure that you are having both evaluation and feedback loops circle in to that logic model. really the logic model, and as well as uh, data driven decision making, is really an iterative process. And we know that, you could put a beautifully crafted logic model down, and then all of a sudden a pandemic hits, or maybe nothing, something not so drastic. Maybe there's been a change in sort of what's happening at the school, and so your after school program maybe needs to switch up in order to meet the needs of what's happening in school and student learning, through your after school program. And so it could go all the way from a drastic pandemic to maybe some tweaks happening in the program. But you want to maybe be able to think about some challenges or obstacles, and actually work through what might happen in those circumstances. And so that's really the benefit of doing this evaluation and feedback loop. So let's move on to data literacy. Here's a great idea around data literacy: is to have the knowledge necessary to gather, analyze, synthesize, and convey information graphically and in writing to support decision making. And so that really is what data literacy is. It's really it's a skill that you want to definitely cultivate, and work through for within your organization, and develop the capacity within your organization. It's really about the ability. So you have all this data. It's the ability to interpret and also use multiple data sources to really look at your program and make sense of how you can actually become better and uh, have a lot greater impact, as well as also meet the changing needs of your participants. So let's move on to see how you identify your data profile. And so we have these four data profiles. So one is a denier. You distrust data and avoid using them. An ignorer is that you don't care about data and have no need for data. An informer is someone who uses data only when it supports your opinions and decisions. And then a data driver. You use data to shape and inform all your decisions. So a poll should be popping up. Why don't you go ahead and share which one you are or most identify with? Ooh, we got lots of really good informers and drivers. Awesome. Awesome. That's great. Looks like we're about split between both an informer using data when it supports your opinions and decisions. And I definitely get that from, like a grant writing perspective, wanting to make sure that we use that data to justify or to communicate the need for our programs, as well as the drivers, again, wanting to use the data to continually improve your program. So awesome. Looks like we're about split. Okay, so that's where everybody is. So, how do you create a data literate program? Well, one of the first things is to locate all your relevant data. And when I say relevant, is really, you know, you, you can be amazed at how much data your program is actually collecting. It's happening all over the place, and you're collecting a lot. But when I talk about relevant, it's really, you want to look at the data that is best connected to the outcomes in your logic model, to maybe the outputs, and maybe also the inputs. And so what is the data that really connects to what you've deemed important via your logic model? The other thing is I worked at a school, and we went hunting for data, and we found we had a lot of data all over the place. And that is exactly the point. It was all over the place. And so we really had to think about what was, not only was the important data and the relevant data, but also where we were locating it and making it acceptable. Oh, I like that, Benjamin. Sorry, I just see this chat. Don't forget aggregator. Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. Um, so with locating your data, you just, not only do you want to find the right data, but you also want to have it place where people can get at it, who need to get at it, and that it makes sense and it's connected back to what's important to your organization. Um, and you want to be able to take that data. A lot of times it's on a Excel spreadsheet, or it's just sort of like test scores off of a teacher's workbook, maybe attendance records. You want to be able to translate that into uh, information, whether it's graphs or reports that can definitely make it more easier to understand and to read. The other thing you want to do is to question the data, to develop what kind of questions either are generating the data and creating the data, or once you get the data, what kind of questions are you want to ask via the data when looking through the data. The other thing is to have the ability to comprehend and interpret data, so that you understand what the test scores are saying, what is there a measurement of error, is there generalization ability, what is all this data saying, and how do I comprehend it. The next piece is really to understand how to apply the data to a data-driven decision making. How does the data you connect to going to affect your decision making? And we'll get into that a little bit more the throughout this presentation. The other thing is really to be empowered with your staff. The more staff, the better. And even not just staff, but you can drill this down into students, participants, families, and community to be able to empower to use the data to drive programmatic and instructional decisions. And so you really want to think about a system, like I said, for data sharing and usage. Provide time. So this is not just time to look at the data, which is extremely important, but also mapping out time to be trained on how to do these, to be able to comprehend and interpret data, to analyze data, as well as to be able to put together agendas and data so that you can actually have fruitful discussions that will then lead to your decisions. And then to provide training. So um, looking at ways, I'm sure you all have your own professional development program sort of set, or you're gearing that up for next year. Looking at how, if you already have that set, looking at how you can embed data driven decision making into current professional developments you may have going on already, or explicitly making it its own separate professional development. And I really want to encourage you that that professional development is not just with the people who are working directly with students, whether that's a teacher or a culture practitioner or a college counselor, or even a professor preparing teachers to go out to work in schools. It is also your fiscal people, it's your operations people. All of those people can be engaged in data driven decision making, and they should. And while it may really connect to their actual work, what you actually want to see in all those different areas that maybe don't have direct and frequent contact with the actual participants is how their work connects back to that participant, right? Our operations, we run schools and we want to make sure our air is clean. Why? Because we want our children to have a healthy environment, and that helps them learn better. With our fiscal, we want to make sure that all of our HR and our fiscal processes are, working well and smoothly, and everyone is being trained. Why? Because that connects back to impacting our learner or our participant. And so always trying to data driven decision making is not just in the classroom, it's throughout your organization. So let's look at how data literate your program is. So a poll is going to be popping up, another poll. And so you can be, maybe your program is data apathetic. Your program decisions are rarely, if ever, driven by data. Again, don't feel bad. I have come from a organization that was a school that was data apathetic. We only used data when we had to do, our reports uh, or yeah, our reports to funders, basically, whether that was the state or with other funders. But we made a commitment to become data driven, which is at the other end. And we put in the hard work to make that change. So if you're data apathetic, you only have room to grow. And if you are data driven, you may just be drilling deeper into how you can make data driven decision making more pervasive throughout your organization. So let's take a look at the poll. We got a lot of data driven. Awesome. The most right now are showing up as data aware. Again, that's great. You're aware of some data, you capture some data, but really only use the data for awareness purposes. That's a great place to start. And so now, again, we can think about and you can plan on what steps you want to take moving forward to become maybe data critical. Maybe you want to set in your logic model around becoming data driven. Maybe you want to set a goal of in the next year, you want to become data critical, and in the following 3 years, be more data driven. Again, just a great way to be able to measure your baseline and move forward. And for those data who are reporting data driven, awesome. Maybe again, you've been doing this for a while. Please provide your thoughts in the chat and your experiences. We really appreciate that. And as well as thinking about how maybe you can dive a little bit deeper into data driven decision making. Okay, so I've been talking data-driven decision making. What is that? Okay, and so data-driven decision making in education really comes out of the use in business practices. Businesses have been identifying problems, developing questions for inquiry, gathering relevant data, analyzing and developing solutions to implement. They have both long-term and short-term cycles, and have been doing this for forever. You can see this. I think a lot of us saw this play out live via the pandemic when we looked at like Amazon or any of the places that we like to buy clothes from. You saw that, like, let's say one of my favorite stories is Ann Taylor. And so I saw that Ann Taylor during the pandemic, really from the data they were getting from their consumers, really shifted and created a whole nother line around work leisure attire. So something that you look professional in, but was comfortable for sitting at home in your home office. And you saw that popping up all over. What is that? That's a result of data driven decision making. They saw people beginning to work at home who needed to do these Zoom meetings. So you need to be professional from the waist up, but on the bottom, they could be comfortable. And so they changed their actual, what the products they were providing. And you can see that happening all over the place on the internet. In education, when it comes to data-driven decision making, and not just education, but definitely like nonprofit, definitely the tech world does this. Engaging people in a collaborative way around data-driven decision making makes the decisions you make more embedded in the everyday operations of the organization. So again, and I think back to my experience with teachers, I could talk about data till I was blue in the face. But until the teachers got involved and saw how it applied to what they were doing on a daily basis, and they were a part of establishing those goals and even the actual evaluation tools, it didn't really change much as far as student impact. And so I am definitely a champion of engaging as many people as possible. We also even engaged parents and students in defining what in short cycle data driven decision making processes on what they were going to achieve both in their families and with their student learning. It's really important if you want to have continuous improvement within your organization and keep everybody sort of on the track around the vision and mission, as well as making that logic model live and a living tool. It helps to identify services for your students and families. Again, I know ACE is really like looking at the needs and making sure that they're providing a range of services to meet those needs. So that's a benefit of this process. Professional development activities, really sort of like looking at your logic model outcomes, and then that is where your heart of your professional development activity is. And through data driven decision making, you just drill down deeper and deeper into the professional development. looking at gaps in the organization as well. Determine the best use of limited resources, also being able to predict for the future and to provide focus and program quality. So that in an overall sense is what data driven decision making is. I'm now going to turn it over to Tracy, and she's going to take us through the first parts of the actual cycle.
Thanks, Alani, and thanks everybody for chiming in on those polls and giving us a sense of where you are with approaching data-driven decision making. So the data-driven decision-making cycle that we're going to talk through today is really comprised of six key steps. You might be using a similar cycle in your own program. I noticed many of you said that you are data-driven, very much data-driven yourself. So some of these might sound pretty familiar, or maybe you're using a similar cycle with slightly different names for your steps. But the first step really is about defining success. We talked about this in our second session in this series of logic models, and it really is an important step for developing your logic model. It really is an important step for getting specific about what you feel successful look like and how you know that you'll achieve that success. So you want to consider, what measures and data you're going to be using and how you're going to define that success. Once you've defined what success will look like, you'll move into that collecting data step. This data collection should and can be happening in an ongoing way, so that you have it and you're able to review it periodically, and not necessarily at the end of the year, solely at the end of the year, or at the end of a program. Analysis is the next step. This involves looking at the data, interpreting the data, and really making meaning of the data, ideally in a collaborative setting. And we'll talk more about each of these steps in detail as well. Engaging others in the data analysis step really does a lot to help develop the data literacy throughout your organization, as well as some specific targeted PD that could happen. But actually going through that process together can really also build awareness and some literacy. Action planning is the next step that comes after analysis. This is when you put your data analysis into action. After that critical step of analysis, you develop some action items based on what that data is telling you. And then, when the analysis takes place in a collaborative way, it's a lot easier to get that project-wide buy-in and support for those action items. Next, you come to implement. This is when you are actively engaged. The leadership and the project team work together to implement your action steps that you put into that action plan. This may involve developing and implementing a calendar, putting some dates behind those action items so that you know when those are going to happen. After implementation comes evaluate. This is when we start to come back around in the circle to take a minute to pause and reflect on how those action items were implemented, if they're helping you to reach those goals that you set, and when you look at redefining some goals and making any adjustments as the data again is telling you. It's really a cycle of ongoing continuous improvement. In sessions 1 and 2 of the series, we discussed the elements of a logic model and how they can inform different types and purposes of program evaluation, and really that first step of defining success. And that, again, is the first step when you're engaging in this data-driven decision-making cycle. So whether you're planning for evaluation, articulating how you're going to collect data for your GEPRA measures, or defining what those program measures are that you're going to track. The first step is really to define what it is you're striving for and how you know you get there, and how you know you've achieved that goal and its impact. You really want to define those specific measures or the evidence of success, and then identify what's really core and what matters most for the success of your program. There's a few levels that you can sort of think about and define achievement. And you see those listed here on the screen right now. The first that you might define for yourself is what success means for the organization. And does it connect to an indicator or a larger impact goal? In the middle level there, depending on the size of your organization, you might also create a program achievement that indicates achievement, what achievement and success will look like for that particular program. And then finally, the third one in the table that you see there are funder measures. And these are measures that are required for the funder to show how the impact is how the program is having a broader impact. So your GEPRA measures would be a good example of these. So for each of these levels of achievement, you have some examples of each there on the right-hand side. And maybe you have some similar success indicators for these different levels of your organization, program, or funders. So that was a little refresher on defining success. The next step is, once you've defined that success, is to go about collecting that data that you need to show success, or at least progress that you're making towards that ultimate goal. Likely the data that you're needed are located in a variety of places. They're going to be a variety of types, come from different levels of your system or organization. You might even involve a number of different partners or external groups that you're collecting data from. So other important aspects to consider around collecting data are the tools that you use to collect it, as well as the tools that you use to house that data, as well as the quality of data itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those considerations now. So first, let's talk about some different types of data. Remember that quantitative data is data that can be measured and written down with numbers, right? It's often thought of that hard data. These are areas where you're measuring things with percentages or scores or rankings, and you might be using tools like assessments. That came up funny. Assessments, whether they're summative or formative, or maybe they come from information collected in rubrics. Think about what kinds of data you have access to that would answer some of the questions on the screen. These are examples of questions that you could answer with quantitative data. And maybe you have some ideas about what kinds of data might answer these questions. I might also ask if anybody has any thoughts in the chat box about the types of quantitative data that you are collecting. The other kind of data that we'll talk about is qualitative data. This is really information about the qualities that are not necessarily as easily measured. Some people think of it as the soft data, and usually is measured more commonly through descriptions or narrative descriptions of the characteristics or the qualities that are present. Tools like focus groups or observation forms can be used to collect this kind of data. So again, on the screen are some examples of different questions that you might be able to answer with this qualitative data. And maybe you are collecting qualitative data as well. Now, sometimes you can turn a qualitative data point into a quantitative data point. So for example, if you administer a feedback survey and you're getting perception data back and you receive, say, 41 of 50 surveys back, you can report a quantitative data point that 82% of your program parents feel that their child's, if this was a question on your survey, that 82% of program parents report they feel their child's language level has improved this school year. So you're still describing a qualitative assessment, but you've been able to quantify some of that feedback. Qualitative data often involves, like I said, stakeholder perceptions or maybe feedback. And you want to think about when you're collecting qualitative data about all of your various stakeholders. And Alani mentioned a variety of stakeholders to be involved in the cycle of data decision making. This is one place where you want to think about, who you want to get input from. It might be students and parents. It could be program staff, administrators, maybe school board or tribal board members. Perhaps thinking more broadly in your community about if you want to get information from businesses or tribal colleges and universities or other institutions of higher education, or maybe even the general community. Another way to think about the types of data you need are to think about in terms of inputs, implementation, or process data, and outcome data. Each type can really give you important information about your programs. And these data types could really be qualitative or quantitative. So input data is going to tell you, provide you with some information about the current status or the people and resources that you have to work with. Implementation and process data, this will tell you about things like the frequency, duration, or quality of the activities and programs provided. This data can help you answer the question, how well did the activities or programs get implemented as intended? That idea of fidelity. And then outcome data will tell you about the impact or the level of change that took place. When we're reporting this data or we're summarizing data, sometimes we want to be able to make correlations, even if we can't make those direct causal relationships between what we did and what the impact was. Really, all of these data are important to help tell the story of your programs and how you're achieving those desired results. So if you were part of our first couple of sessions, this might have sounded a little bit familiar. Those three types of data, input, process or implementation, and outcome data, really correspond nicely to the elements of the logic model. So remember this, you may recall this example from our first couple of sessions. This is a logic model from a program to prevent inappropriate youth tobacco use. So if we're thinking about data and program inputs, this is where we're thinking about input data. Activities and outputs correspond with that program or process or implementation data. And there we go. And then finally, the outcome data that I just described on the previous slide are those specific indicators and measures of success related to your program impact, what we refer to as the outcomes on our logic model. Okay, so let's pause for just a second here. And we're going to use an annotation tool. So I'm going to ask everyone to be engaged here and give us some responses on the screen. If you look, the question that we're interested in getting your input on is what types of data that you collect. And if you're thinking about all the different types that we just described, using your annotation tools that you're going to find by looking at the top of your screen. If you look up there where it says you're viewing Tracy's screen, you'll see a little drop down menu there, and you should see a little option that allows you to annotate. And if you click on that little annotate button, you're going to get a little menu of options. You can choose text to type some text on the screen. You could draw if you want to try to write with your mouse. That's always a fun little exercise. You can use the draw tool. So maybe the text tool is the one that you want to go. But if you click on that and then you hover over the screen, you'll be able to type right on the screen and your responses will appear here. So what types of data do you currently collect? Do you collect qualitative data? If so, what does that look like? Do you collect quantitative data? Or maybe you're collecting some program and implementation data. Yep, so you're going to hover over at the top of your screen, click where it says View Options, and then the drop-down menu that appears if you go, you'll scroll down to Annotate there. Oh, I see we've got some responses coming up there in a lovely blue color, so some qualitative data. I wonder what that qualitative data is. Is that focus group data? Could that be survey data? Oops, sorry, I'm gonna come back. There we go. I see we've got some quantitative data examples, some ACT scores. Oh, here's come some more responses, very good. So quantitative data, student assessments, absence reports, student map achievement, measures of academic progress, I think is what that stands for. Participant logs for events, good. Those are things that we can report in numbers. Okay, I see some examples of qualitative data going up there, stakeholder surveys. Another example of attendance records, good. Everyone's finding those annotation tools now. If you're having trouble and you want to put in something, you can always type into the chat box in case you can't find those annotation tools too. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? Somebody's wrote up here that they are collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. Video interviews, very good. Okay, that's a great example of some qualitative interview or qualitative data, sorry. Great. See some responses coming and going up there too. If you need to move your little text box too, looking back at that annotation panel, there's just a couple slots to the left, you'll see a mouse tool, and that allows you to sort of hover over your text box and move it if you want to. Oops, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Didn't mean to do that. All right, these are some really, really good examples. So we're going to dive a little bit further into some different types of data. And I'm going to come back to this question in a minute. But as you've been sharing, and as I talk through the next couple of slides, what data do you wish you had? What data would be helpful for your program, maybe that you don't currently have access to, or maybe it's just not being collected anywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and talk and clear out these responses now. Thank you for sharing all of your responses. And then we'll come back to this question in just a minute here. Okay. All right, we'll make sure we get these cleared out so that we're going to come back to this in just a minute. All right, so most of your data are going to come from one of these four categories, right? So starting at the top, if you think about the state level, these are examples of state level data. Might be your end of year summative assessments, those standardized assessments that students are taking. Maybe you can think of some other examples. The next level down in yellow there are your district or organizational level data. Typically these might be like formative assessments or maybe benchmark assessments. They happen more often than annually, maybe a couple of times a year, right? The next level down in the red color there is program or school level data. So a lot of the data that gets collected in schools anyways is sometimes reported up at the district or organizational level. But there might be some data that actually is generated and kept at the school level, or maybe at your program level. That could be information about family language use or levels of education, conditions for home learning, or maybe services available, attendance. That was one example we saw on the screen previously. Behavior could be come from this level as well, or maybe health screenings or special needs, student special needs. And then finally, at the base, we see that activity or classroom level data. This data can really be some of the most informative data if you have the time and make the time to both collect it and use it. So some examples there could be, the homework or classwork or project work that students are engaged in. It could be those informal or formative assessments that happen in the course of providing services or activities to parents or students or others. So your annotation tools are still available. And if we could take just another minute now, if you would go ahead and open up your annotation tools, I'm curious to know which of the levels of data do you think is easiest to collect? Go ahead and find those annotation tools, and maybe this time just put like a little X or a stamp next to the level that you feel is the easiest to access. Okay, we've got some stars going up around program and activity. Excellent. It's good to be resourceful. You can get all of those. I would love to know some of your tricks for getting maybe some of those hard to get data. So end of year assessments. Okay, those are publicly reported. Or in an aggregate way. So maybe those are the easiest to find. It looks like everybody's really responding to a variety. Excellent. Okay, we've got a lot of marks, and I see like some of this is you feel is pretty easy. I'm going to clear these and ask the opposite question now. So I'm going to pause and just clear all those and now ask you, which of these levels do you think are the hardest to collect? I saw a lot of you saying that some of these are pretty easy, but are there any that are particularly challenging? All right, we got formative, maybe that classroom or activity level, and the program level. And I think we have time for maybe a couple of shares about this. Would anybody like to take themselves off mute and maybe just say a few words about what the challenges could be around these collecting data at these levels? Any takers? Yep, you can also share in the chat box too if you don't want to come off mute, but we'd love to hear from one or two folks maybe.
Hi, good morning or afternoon.
Francis?
I'm with the NYCP and Salt River, and I feel like the hardest for us is surveys from our community. I feel like a lot of our the members of the community don't really do a lot of surveys, if you will. Only if there's, I notice only if there's an incentive. It's hard to just get them to do surveys willingly. I don't know if that has to do with because they're already doing a lot of paperwork with other organizations, because we have a lot of programs here, and most of us collect surveys. So I really don't know what it is, but I feel like that's a struggle for us. So if anyone has any suggestions or feedback of how to get our families to do surveys, I'd like to hear it.
Great. Yes, I've definitely heard that to be a challenge before. So definitely, if anybody has ideas about what's worked for them, we'd love to hear from you. Anybody else? There were a couple other people, I think, who had something to say about challenges.
So I was just going to add that that a lot of times it's about setting the stage when you're talking about qualitative data gathering, and a lot of times it's we're so used to gathering. It's and not to say that it's easy, but the quantitative is what LEAs want, what SEAs want, and that's that's kind of the driving force. But I also think that on the flip side of that, when we're looking at collecting qualitative data and what that looks like from a community-based initiative, there needs to be some foundational components laid down. And a lot of times in our communities, we weren't, especially in Native communities, weren't asked what we thought or how we felt or how we engage in an educational realm. We've been disenfranchised and marginalized in a lot of ways from that participation. So there is a bit of a foundational component that needs to be laid out, so people start to feel that they can be comfortable with it, that their voice is going to be utilized and their opinions are going to be utilized in a meaningful, positive way, but also being able to see what the impact of that is and having them be a part of an educational system instead of being on the periphery, and being able to be an advocate and a supporter rather than an active participant in an educational setting, rather than it just be I'm sending my kids over there and I really don't have a whole bunch of say in what happens at that place. So it really does, part of the challenge is really intentionally trying to create a space for understanding of what, so that people start to feel comfortable, but also that they're a part of this process.
Thank you, Francis. That was really beautifully said. You're absolutely right about that reluctance to engage. I've bumped up against that, and I'm sure many others have too. It does, and you're absolutely right. It takes time to build that trust that you're going to use that information in a good way, and to be transparent too, right, about how that data is being used, and to show them that their input is having an impact. Really great point. Thank you. Okay, so we've shared it a little bit further now about different data types, and I'm going to come back to this question. Is there any data that you wish you had? I'm going to clear the drawings one last time here, and give you an opportunity to put up on the, use those annotation tools again to type up on the screen, what kinds of data do you wish you had? Maybe this is a brand new type of data, or maybe it's it's existing data that you don't yet have access to. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Do you have all the data you need? Sometimes we're data rich, right? We have lots and lots of data. It's just taking the time to look at it and make sense of it can be a challenge. Okay, somebody says here, what was the faced by Indigenous students during COVID in our rural? Okay, so you want to know more about the challenges that our Native students have faced in the COVID, especially in rural communities. Somebody else writes about wanting more qualitative data. Collecting quality feedback from the tribe can be time consuming. Parent surveys, or pre and post surveys, okay. Data from, I'm leaning down here to look at my screen, data from entire student record, kindergarten through 12th grade. Okay, so that's data that you wish you had. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here and maybe just put some questions to stimulate some thinking, but how feasible would getting some of this data be? Like, who would you need to help you, or what would need to be put in place? If you were going to do, say, parent surveys pre and post, what would need to be put in place, or who would need to be involved? Or maybe, being able to access those K-12 academic student records. What would need to happen? Does anybody have any thoughts about any follow-up steps that you could take to maybe attain some of this data? I know that might be a big one to think about. Parent surveys, both paper and computer options. Most parents use social media. So announcements to check their email might be necessary. That's a good idea, maybe for getting upping that response rate. Trinidad writes in the chat box also that social media works well for her community. Good, good. Okay, well, I'm gonna let you mull that over a little bit about, you know, what would we need to put in place, or maybe who might help get access to this data, or who might help you create some of this data, collect some of this data. I'll just leave that for now, so we'll keep going. But I really thank you for this. This is good input and good sharing. And please continue to share your thoughts in the chat box as well as you turn over these questions in your mind. I'm going to jump into talking a little bit about data quality. Right, and that was actually something that somebody mentioned on the annotation screen here, right on the previous slide. When you're collecting data, you want to make sure that your data is really quality data, and there's a few characteristics listed on the screen there to keep in mind. So the first is accuracy, making sure that the data represents what it should, that it's valid data, complete data. This one can be a challenge sometimes. You want to, minimize the gaps or the missing data points in your data. And a lot of times there's follow-up necessary to get more data. I'm collecting data on a survey right now. I just extended the window and sent out another round of email, please, to please reply. Consistency. Making sure that the types of data that you're collecting really aligns with the expectations about how that's collected, how the tools, if there's a tool like a rubric being used, that it's being used the same consistently from one person to the next, or that data is being collected regularly from one measuring period to another. And uniqueness. So even this kind of touches on an issue that came up earlier. But maybe the data that you want is already being collected somewhere. Is it possible to collaborate so that people don't have to maybe respond to the same question more often than is necessary? Even if your data are, excuse me, even if you can use the same data in multiple ways there. You can use the same data in multiple ways. And if maybe you are collecting new data that is not being collected anywhere else currently. And then timeliness. So this is key when we're talking about data-driven decision making. Having data available when it's needed so that it can be used effectively. Remember, when the better the quality of your data, the better the quality of your decisions. So once you've thought about what data you're collecting and how you're going to collect it, really the next question is, how do you keep track of it all? Many programs find a data collection planner that's helpful. You can think of it as like an inventory where you can sort of capture in one place where all of those data pieces that you're collecting over the course of a year, and capturing all those details about what it measures, when it's collected, who's responsible for collecting and tracking and logging that data, as well as when that data is going to be shared and discussed or analyzed. So I'm going to point you now to another tool, another Zoom tool, your reaction buttons. If you look down towards the bottom of your screen, you'll probably see a little button that says reactions, and you can hover over that and give me either a thumbs up or a thumbs down to indicate whether your program currently has a place where you're compiling all these data measures. Anybody find it? I see somebody's got a thumbs up there. Spencer says, yep, he's got one. Kenneth says he's got one. Trinidad, all right, that's great. Looks like several folks have a place where they're inventorying all of those things, and that can be super useful. So that's right. We've got a lot of data drivers on the call here today. The example that you see on the screen is actually an excerpt from a project planners, which many of you may already use. Okay. So once you know where the data will be collected from and when you expect to have it, who's responsible for it, determining where the actual data measures will be housed and how you're going to track them over time can be a key consideration. So you might actually have already a data reporting tool, or maybe a data dashboard or other mechanism in place to house that data. This can be, I know, a major consideration for many grantees. If you don't have one, maybe you're thinking about one and what you can do to put that in place. So let's use the thumbs up and thumbs down buttons again one more time. And maybe you can tell us thumbs up if you have a system in place, and then thumbs down if you don't, and maybe you're thinking about it. All right. Again, several folks look like they have a system. Jeremy, maybe your program doesn't have one. Maybe you're thinking about one. That's good. I know if we had more time, we could maybe delve more deeply into this and sharing around what sorts of collection system you're using. I know that's going to vary widely according to your needs and your context. So we'll save that deeper discussion for another day. But for now, if you have any questions for your fellow grantee peers, and you can ask questions in the chat box there. Yep, Jeremy says he's thinking about one. That's good. That's good. Okay. So that was all about collecting data. Let's talk now about analyzing data. This is such an important step, and honestly, one of my favorites personally. When we have a variety of types and sources of high quality data, this next step of analysis is really much more meaningful and leads to rich and insightful discussions. We mentioned a couple of times that ideally this data analysis is taking place in a collaborative setting, that you're not alone in a room in isolation, analyzing that data. And we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. But another pitfall to avoid in this step is really to avoid jumping too quickly from making a data statement, here's what my data says, right into a solution or an action item. So in this section, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about how to break up these steps down into some very discrete but very important mini steps. Excuse me. The first step is really about making observations and inferences. We always start with those observations. Those are really the data statements. This is what the data says. Like I said, it can be really tempting to jump into, so this is what it means and this is what we need to do. But if we jump too quickly into what do we do about it, sometimes we might miss some really good insights about what the data is telling us, or we don't want to get into a situation of just latching onto a potential solution that doesn't really actually address the underlying issues that the data is getting at. So you really want to not make any assumptions, and take that time to make those observations without making the inferences. So looking at what does the data say? Once you've made your observations, you can move into making those inferences. Remember, an inference is not a wild guess, but that conclusion based on your evidence. So based on the observations, what is the biggest challenge? What are students performing? Why are students performing the way they are? And as you look at those areas of opportunity, challenge, and excellence, you might continue to ask why. And those inferences are what will guide you to that data-driven decision making. So here are some examples of both some observations and then how they're used to create an inference. So let's say you just got the results of your mid-year language assessment back, and you're working with your instructional team to observe the assessment data. You notice that 75% of third grade students were able to successfully conduct a basic conversation in the native language. However, only about 45% of the third graders could write a short paragraph. So you're going to discuss with your team, right, and make some, after you've made those data observations, then you'll make some inferences from those observations. So you may infer that your third graders have greater oral language skills than written language skills and need additional practice in writing. That's a solid inference based on observations. Although the team could also have inferred that having third graders write a short paragraph maybe wasn't an appropriate assessment for mid-year, because that skill is not introduced till later in January, and students really haven't had the sufficient practice. So this is why having a team who's involved with those different aspects of program implementation is so important, so that one quick assumption doesn't become that final inference. More heads at the table are always better than one. I always say that collectively we are more insightful, we have more experience and insight and expertise than any one of us do individually. Don't be afraid to ask questions about the data, or maybe discover that you need more or better data in order to move forward. Two great methods for data analysis, and maybe some of you have engaged in these activities, are data walks and data discussions. And really they could even be combined for a really powerful dive into your data. So for a data walk, you would have that the way that works is to have, data like printouts or charts posted in different places around the room. When we're all able to be together, you can have different areas with different data points, or maybe different tools. You can have people work together either in small groups or do a silent gallery walk, if you will. Working their way around the room and maybe using sticky notes to make observations and posting those on the chart. I can tell you from experience that the exercise of making data observations and separating that really deliberately from data inferences can take a little practice and a little coaching with your team. And again, that's a great opportunity to help build that data literacy of your program. So then once everybody makes those observations about the data, you kind of debrief, discussing all the various data points, and then you start to ask why. Why are we seeing what we're seeing? And then you use that information in the next step of planning. So here is a process. I'm going to talk a little bit about that process for collaborative analysis, because there's some really key steps that can make that very, very powerful. So when you're planning to have stakeholders at the table, and it could be people who are engaged with implementing the program, you might have community members or other stakeholders, you might even have your evaluators at the table for a data analysis event. You'll want to create the agenda first, right? Figure out what you're going to need at the table, and possibly even create some pre-work. That the discussion is going to be better if everyone has taken some time to at least kind of get oriented to the data. Maybe even they even have some time to look at it and identify some ahas before they come to the meeting. You want to establish and practice some roles. Some key roles might be facilitator or note taker or timekeeper, to kind of so everybody knows what's expected of them and what their role is in the process. And would encourage you to rotate these roles. If you're having the same participants at your data analysis meetings, you might consider trading off roles so that everyone gets a little bit of practice. Establishing you may already have some behavioral norms for your meetings, but this can be really key in a data analysis meeting. You know, data can often reflect, I often say there's sometimes few degrees of separation between the data and my work. It can be very personal, and just being able to have a norm about letting the data speak, that maybe we're not going to defend the data, and might be some norms to consider for these kinds of meetings. You want to develop some starter questions to get the discussion going. That can also help you focus the discussion, so that's not going in a million different directions, but serves as a common starting point. And there's actually some really good protocols and examples that you can draw from, so that you don't have to start from scratch there. And then finally, make sure your agenda includes that opportunity to identify measurable action steps. So here on the screen are some data discussion questions. You may have used some of these already in some of your work, since we have so many data drivers here on the call with us today. If you have some other great discussion questions, I'd love to have you put those in the chat box and share them. Here is a potential agenda items for your data analysis meeting. Having those clear objectives, knowing their roles and assignments and what their focus is, reviewing those norms, looking at those grounding documents, so really getting oriented to what it is we're going to be looking at. And then also maybe even getting a little oriented to the data. So where did the data come from? How was it collected? When was it collected? Are all examples of getting oriented. And then you dive into that data review, the really meat and potatoes part of the agenda. And then finally, action steps. So I'm going to put these links are on the screen, and we can put them in the chat box as well. But this is a resource of some data discussion protocols that have been used in the field for a number of years. And depending on your purpose, they might be of interest to you. So these have many of the same kinds of discussion questions, roles, and objectives that we just shared on the previous screens. And these really lend themselves nicely to modifying them too. So you can adjust the times on here, you know, depending on how long your meeting will be. You can tweak the objectives and so forth to your purpose. Okay. Alani, I'm going to pass it back over to you now to talk through action planning.
Okay, great. So thanks, Tracy. Thanks for taking us through really the heart of data-driven decision-making. Now we're going to sort of move to the legs, where we're going to get some movement and taking our data and making it move in our organization. So let's move on to the next slide. Thanks. So nobody really wants to give a test or give homework just for the sake of giving it. Really, you want to, or even like was talked about earlier, surveys. You know, you really want to lay a foundation for the reason why you are doing these things. And really that connects back to our action plan. You want to now that you have your data and you've conducted your observations, drew inferences about the data and concluded, we want to now really take those conclusions and move it into what we're going to do. Again, the legs of data-driven decision-making. So let's move to goal setting. Now, I'm sure you folks could all come up and tell me what SMART means blindfolded. But we really want to make sure when we start goal setting, we want to start with creating a SMART goal, a goal that is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. That's really what we want to start. So we would get that SMART goal from looking at our observations and inferences. So we could go to the next slide and we'll see we'll work through how to do that. So again, through our observation and inferences that Tracy took us through, we look at that and we start to think about what would our potential goal be. Tracy, can you click that one more time so I can get that? Thanks. Super awesome. So based on our observation of 75% of third graders can conduct a basic conversation in native language, our inference was that their language skills were better or at than their written skills. Our SMART goal we've set is that by the end of fall semester, 90% of third grade students will be able to write a complete sentence in the native language as measured by a writing example. Again, a really awesome SMART goal. It has all those elements. I know in working with teachers in this area, you probably want to take have an additional conversation and get real clear that all the teachers know what a complete sentence means for a third grade class. So that, again, if you're dealing with multiple third grade teachers, that everyone is real clear about what that complete sentence is. You really, when you talk about these SMART goals, a lot of the elements you want, again, to sort of have discussion around the elements. So when we look at the second SMART goal, by the end of the year, 80% of third grade students will be able to write a short paragraph. Now that's getting us to sort of that end of the year goal. And as you can see, we have both mid-range or intermediate goal, which is the first one, as well as maybe a longer term goal, which is the second one, which would be measured at the end of the year. Again, when you think about short paragraph, getting the teachers to come together and really clearly define what a short paragraph means and what are the elements of a short paragraph. The other great additional step was, if you had the time, to actually have the teachers sit down and talk about what potentially that assessment might look like. Do we have a question? Oh, okay, you got it, Tracy. So this is a potential discussion that you might have in your group. And so first of all, we'd be reviewing that SMART goal. You know, our SMART goal is that by the end of a project period, the 5 teacher trainees will attain at least be intermediate or high levels of instructional language proficiency. And then so somebody in the group says, well, how do we get that? I think that's the next. Yeah. So how did you set that SMART goal? Well, then we would go back and somebody would answer that that response with, oh, it's missing. Oh, so then it would be 4 out of 5 teachers, trainees were assessed at novice. So this is going back to the observation and inference. And then the next person would say, well, where are we? How have we progressed? And then the response would be, well, right now our progression is that 1 teacher trainee is at intermediate high, 1 is at data intermediate low, and 2 are at novice high, and 1 at novice mid. I agree with Tracy. The discussion around inferences, observation and inferences are some of the most interesting conversations to have with staff and as well as with teachers, and really leads to the development of some great SMART goals. So when we would take all of that, we would then put it into like an action plan. Now this helps us to be mindful and to take notes so that we know what our expectations are. So at the top, we would put our SMART goal, the current status, and then strategies. Now, for a particular SMART goal, you may have 1, 2, maybe 3 strategies. To go beyond 3, you might want to really consider, like, you might not want 7 strategies. You might want to think about those strategies, and is it actually, some of them, do they actually relate to another goal? So really thinking about what can be done. And again, going back to that, to the A in action plan is like, is it attainable? Then we would work out action steps. So Tracy, if you could go to the next slide and we'll see an actual example. Thanks. So again, we have that example, our SMART goal. Our first strategy is around teacher trainees will participate in at least 1 hour of adult language learning each week. Again, even within that strategy, there is some level of measurability in that we know all of them will be doing 1 hour, 1 time a week. So we can actually even measure that. Then we have action steps. We have the different steps. We're putting the legs on all of these goals and strategies. Secure a teacher, determine weekly schedule, and implement weekly language classes. We have materials, and then also a timeline and persons responsible. So in all of these pieces of information help to identify what other parts of the program may be affected by this actual action plan. And so when you look at materials, maybe some of the materials are not currently in your budget. And so you need to really rethink your budget. The other thing is that person responsible, maybe, one person out of three action steps, only one person is be listed there. Maybe you need to think about spreading that out if you possibly can. Also looking at the timeline, does it fit into the timeline of your SMART goal and help you achieve that? And is it realistic? And then strategy two is to actually do that. The language specialist will actually do some uh, coaching, I guess it would be the best word, around language proficiency. As you can see here, this is really program performance where you are looking at developing an observational protocol. Now, again, with all of the action steps, having a further discussion about what that actual expectation is. So, for example, um, a, to develop an observation protocol, what is the expectations? Is that like the process? Is that coaching forms? Is that an assessment? What does that look like? And to have further discussion in those areas. So we can move forward, Tracy. Thanks. So what we want to do is when we think about our action plan, again, because this is our legs, this is where we're going to start to really rock and roll. We want to make sure we maybe check off this list. Is our action plan and our goals SMART? Are they based on our strategies based on best practices? Is one of member of the entire team, is everyone in favor of it? Now, maybe it's not consensus, maybe you do consensus, maybe it's not, but is everybody behind it to sort of see it through, whether they are like firmly like believers in it or not, they're willing to sort of take a stab at it and try, and everybody's willing to do the work. Is this dependent on other activities or programs or other parts of the organization? Is there certain areas assigned to a specific individual? Now, again, in that responsibility part, it may actually be a team that's working on it, but you want to indicate one person that is going to be responsible for reporting back and being accountable to that actual action and activity. Is it feasible? Can it be done in time? Do you have the money to do it? And then will it lead to accomplishing the SMART goal? Just a sort of small checklist you want to think about. Now, again, with our logic model and action plan, you may want to think about, does the action plan affect the logic model? Do we need to go into change the logic model? Those are all really important. So whether it's the logic model or your action plan, communicating it to make it a live functioning document is really important. Is everyone responsible for tasks aware of their responsibilities and deadlines? And also, are they clear about the work that needs to be done in that action plan? Are there individuals accountable for tasks that need to approve an action? So maybe a team is coming together with an action plan, but maybe the administrator needs to review it and approve it. Or maybe it actually needs, because it has fiscal implications, maybe your finance manager or CFO needs to be able to approve it as well. Are there individuals or groups that need to be consulted for feedback? So maybe you want to connect in with your cultural practitioners. Are you connecting back in with maybe your elders? Are there other people, maybe the university, that need to be engaged and provide feedback to your action plan before you maybe make it live? And are there individuals or groups that need to be informed of the action plan items or action items or plan? That again goes to wanting to make this process transparent and to get as many people engaged. I know, again, back to the school I was, we often discussed whether or not we wanted to share the intricacies of what was going on with data to parents, and at what level and what information were we sharing in order to, and I think the comment that was made earlier, to develop that foundation. People need to see that the surveys that they participated in actually goes into the classroom and actually impacts what's happening in their child's classroom. And so by showing that loop, it helps to keep them further engaged and hopefully participate um, further. So once we've got that action plan, we want to move on to the next step, which is actually implementation. I see there's questions popping up, but I'll let Tracy take care of that because it might take me off. So when we think about implementation, it's really about integrating the action steps into your ongoing work. And so this may or may not, like for most organizations, an action plan based on data does not do a full stop to an entire program. What it usually is small tweaks to logic model or to maybe practices that are going on. It's not like a full stop on the program. And so you're going to want to think about how are you going to fold this into what's kind of going on already. You may want to think about going back again to your logic model and looking at revising your inputs and outputs. What's key around your action plan is you do want to do it with fidelity. So whatever the steps you came up with, you want to do it with fidelity. And maybe, in order for you to see if that strategy actually worked and you were able to actually get the goal that you were striving for. Now, if it doesn't, then you need to make note of that and you are getting the doesn't, it's not working, back from your data. So you'll go back into that cycle. So let's move on into implementation. Sorry. Again, I just want to really sort of focus on, doing this with fidelity and doing this also collaboratively. So let's look at our implementation from our example related to third grade, writing, being able to write in their native language in at the end of the year, 80% of them be able to write a short paragraph. And so when we think of curriculum and instructional strategies, we're really talking about the what and the how. And so with that example, our what is native language paragraph writing. Our how is maybe we want the students to be able to practice being able to write short sentences. And so we want to increase their time where they are able to do independent practice. And so that's sort of the difference between the what and the how. And now we're moving into evaluate. Take it away, Tracy.
Thanks, Alani. So evaluate now is when we're starting to circle back, from the action plan to determine if what we decided to do was if we did it and if it was successful. These shorter cycles of data-driven decision making. This is a short cycles type of evaluation or assessment of accomplishing our plans SMART goal. Not a big end of program, end of grant evaluation, but shorter cycles that take place throughout the program year. So when we're in the evaluation step, we're thinking about, was our action plan carried out as intended? What evidence do we have to prove that those actions were carried out and that it's having that impact that we're aiming for? This final step in the cycle is really important because it gives us a framework and information to support further action. It confirms that actions are being taken and being effective. It gives us opportunities to make adjustments, or maybe it has maybe where it reveals opportunity for new or increased improvement. It really helps justify our actions to others. Builds in increased support and helps us to make efficient use of our resources. So we looked earlier at the types of data that we're collecting. And so this graphic looks specifically at how data could be used to evaluate implementation of your action plan, the evidence that you would look at in order to judge whether or not your action plan is being implemented as intended. So you see that the chart progresses from annual forms of evaluation to continuous forms of ongoing evaluation or assessment. The point of this step is really to measure progress in implementation and achievement along the way so that you can adjust your action plan as needed rather than waiting to the end and then continuing that data-driven cycle anew. So really what we're talking about in this whole cycle of data-driven decision making is continuous improvement, and data is really the key to making that happen. Sometimes data can raise more questions than it answers, and therefore data-driven decision making is really that ongoing process. As you get new data, you analyze it and set new goals, and then as you reach those goals, you enter that cycle and push on for greater heights. So when we're talking about monitoring, and I know we're getting towards to the bottom of our time here, we might look at different types of long-term data tracking. That longitudinal data, where you're tracking the same group of students across time to look for individual growth, or cross-sectional data that's really looking at a specific data point in time so that you can kind of get that snapshot and that looks at program impact, where you're okay. And then as you look back at your action plan, you want to identify the evidence that you're going to be looking for to make sure that those action steps have been successful. So this is an excerpt from an action plan. You might consider adding a column of evidence to specify, like, what is that proof that that action step was accomplished. And then, as Alani suggested, reconnecting with your model, with your logic model. If when you're doing these short cycle data-driven decision-making cycles, you might find that you need to make adjustments to that logic model. Do the activities connect to the outcomes as you expected? Do you need to add another interim outcome that's showing to be very important? And then I saw some questions too about communicating and presenting data. And when you're communicating with data, you really want to provide it and organize it in a way that provides good insights and is easily digestible. Really thinking about what you want to share with the audience. So remember, you want to think through about how you want to tell your story, and maybe you want to use some different tools to represent your data. You know, you can think of different types of charts or graphs, or maybe a dynamic display like those online dashboards that some of you may be working with. There is also a really great data session from our recent project directors meeting. So if you want to delve a little bit further into that, we'll post that link in the chat box for you as well. So we've talked through all of these steps in the cycle, and you have some questions here. I see some questions come up in the chat box, and we want to make time to answer your questions. But I'm going to keep going through so that Olani can share our feedback surveys with you, and you can, if you need to jump off quickly, you'll at least have a minute or two to give us your feedback on today's session.
Awesome. Wow, that was a run through. So let's go. We have a poll popping up here. If you could please complete that. And before you go, we also have the link for the survey. That is important data to us that we actually review and use to make decisions. So please help us utilize the data-driven decision-making process so that we can create sessions that are relevant and important to you. Thanks again for joining us. We do have some sessions coming up. So again, this coming month, remaining of June and this coming month. So this week we have the NOL talking circle. We're going to be going through some data and we're going to be doing some actions. So please join that if you have a NOL grant. We also have the demo STEP and PD talking circles coming up in July, as well as on the 24th, we also have office hours, where it's a time for you to ask questions and get any type of assistance. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for doing the in-session poll, and don't forget to do the out-session poll. Here's our contact information. You can contact your program officers, as well as if you have any questions regarding technical assistance, you can email us at oieSEIservice@seiservices.com. Make sure to include your PR number so we can know which grant you are asking questions from. Again, thank you so much for participating. Any final words, Tracy?
No, that way I know that was a lot to go through. So if you have any reflections or thought for us about what you'd like to see more of in upcoming TA sessions, we're always open to your input. And if there are any lingering questions, I know I can stay on for a little bit longer too, and maybe we can respond to any unanswered questions.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.